Our next guest describes the topic that we're about to discuss this way, quote, "It's death by 1,000 paper cuts," and we are talking about microaggressions. With more, we're joined by anti-racism educator and founder of the anti-racism course, Salam Debs, in studio. Salam, welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me, Sid.
All right, microaggression. It is a very important topic. I also think it's a topic a lot of our audience might not be overly familiar with. Before we dive into the specifics of what to look out for, how would you define it?
Well, microaggressions are really daily, slights and insults that feel like they're commonplace. They seem very normal, and they typically happen when we're talking about racial microaggressions. They happen to Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks. And often when we think about micro, we think micro means small, right? It seems like it's small, but really what we're saying is it's daily and it's interpersonal. Whereas macro is like systemic racism, institutional racism. So we're talking about the ways in which those daily harms actually lead to mental health disparity in many ways and are death by 1,000 paper cuts.
So when they continue over and over and over again, there can be real damage done.
Oh yeah, very serious damage. Like we know that racial trauma, leads to depression, anxiety, imposter syndrome, and impacts your daily life outcomes.
For sure. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. I have a bunch of phrases here that Salam would like me to throw out to people at home, and you are going to walk us through why this is completely not something that should be uttered. This does do harm. It does affect people's mental health. So I'm going to go through a few of these phrases here, okay? I'm going to start with, "I don't see color."
Well, firstly, there's no such thing as colorblindness, right? Colorblindness is this idea that, we can eradicate racism by not seeing color. It's kind of like saying, "I'm not a racist," when we really want to move towards being anti-racist. And, colorblindness perpetuates this idea that, I'm going to treat you as a white person. It's kind of code for saying I'm going to treat you as white. And it also minimizes Black, Indigenous, and racialized people's experiences, lived experiences. And what we want to do is move away from colorblindness, and actually we want to look at what racial disparities exist in society.
Fair enough, for sure. Next one, I can tell you I've never said this. "You're so exotic looking."
You'd be surprised. It happens often, especially to Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks. And this idea of exoticness, you look exotic, is kind of rooted in, I'm sure you agree that we grew up with images of World Vision and National Geographic that really depicted this imagery and narrative that Black, Indigenous, and racialized people are something to study and pathologize, when really what that does is it further dehumanizes, right? That kind of fetishization dehumanizes groups of people. And so it's important to understand that this idea of exoticness is othering. It's kind of similar to, this idea of if a Black, Indigenous, or racialized person moves to Canada, or a racialized or brown Black person, they're considered immigrants. When a white person moves to, Costa Rica, they're considered expats. And so we need to understand that it's about power dynamics and the impacts on people's lives.
The third one, Salam, that you wanted to talk about is the phrase, "But where are you really from?"
So where are you really from is a question I've experienced my whole life. I know I watched my mom growing up here in Canada her whole life. And really the first question is, where are you from? And then usually the response is, I'm Canadian. And then the last question is, but where are you really from? And that perpetuates this idea that Black and racialized and brown people cannot be Canadian, and that Canadianness is synonymous with whiteness, right? When really we know Indigenous peoples are, the original inhabitants of this land.
Those are important to break down going forward for anyone out there, because if you are saying things like this and don't realize the damage that it does, or if you're in a situation where you're hearing things of this nature, it's important to know what's really going on here. So what would you say, Salam, to people at home who are either one of the two camps, either are saying these things and don't realize what they mean, or are hearing them, and how can they avoid subjecting others to constant microaggressions?
Yeah, well, I think the solution is, firstly, identifying what microaggressions are. First of all, recognizing that microaggressions are not micro, They're death by 1,000 paper cuts. They're incredibly harmful. Learn about them, invest in that learning. Secondly, I would say really move outside of colorblindness completely, throw that away, and start to, learn about what your identity is. Learn about what it means to be white, cisgender, to be part of the dominant culture, and start to analyze and recognize your own social, it's called your social location or your positionality, so you can start to understand your different identities and realize how they shape you. Your identities do shape you. There's no such thing as neutrality. You can't be neutral. There's no such thing as objectivity. We're either actually examining and excavating our biases, or we're just doing it unconsciously, which is harmful. And then lastly, I would say, learn about Canada's history. That's what I teach. I teach about understanding Canada's colonial history, understanding that we had 250 years of enslavement in Canada, that we had, internment camps that impacted Japanese people, Chinese head tax. I mean, we could go on and on. The list goes on and on, genocide of Indigenous peoples. And so we want to learn so that we can do better and we can connect the dots in a real way.
We got 30 seconds. Tell me about the anti-racism course you founded.
Well, the anti-racism course that I developed helps people do exactly what we're doing right now, which is talk, learn, unlearn, examine, build awareness, build a critical thinking lens, so that, again, you move away from being not racist to being anti-racist and being proactive in how you show up in the world.
Salam Debs is an anti-racism educator and founder of the anti-racism course. SalamDebs.com is where you can find more information, and on IG, Salam Debs is where you can find Salam. Thank you very much for coming by.
Thank you, Sid.
Let's continue the conversation.
Absolutely.
It's an important one. More BT coming up right after this.